Welcome everyone. My name is Andre Bagley. I'm an ICAP accredited genealogist with Swedish specialization, and today we're going to talk about something that may trip up even a experienced researcher. How Swedish history I'm going to talk about specifically how Swedish history fundamentally changes the way one reads and interprets genealogical records from that place. This isn't intended to be a records overview, but I will mention it and how these events impact these different records. I'm assuming you know about your household examination records, your general parish registers, moving records, court records, and their various subcategories, military-related documents and so forth. What we're doing today is building a historical framework that explains why these records look the way they do, and their interpretation, and why names can be different, and why there might be discrepancies that might not actually be discrepancies. They're just discrepancies in your understanding of the reality of that particular time, and so why some people don't appear where you expect them to be. So anyways, let's move on. So finding a record and interpreting a record are two different skills. A lot of genealogy education spends they spend a lot of time talking about the how-tos, not explaining the whys and the background and the history. They'll tell you that the records exist and how you can search them, but they don't tell you about the history surrounding the area, because that history, records are created in history, and what we have is a product of what was normal for the time and more standard practice, and sometimes we miss some subtle nuances that really make a significant impact on how we can interpret these records if we didn't understand the background, what was going on. Like, what does it mean to be legitimate? At what point, there's a period in history where you only had to be betrothed to somebody to have legitimate offspring. Maybe you didn't ever progress to a full marriage ceremony, technically, and it was still considered fine. Then that changed, and that marriage became an absolute requirement. That might surprise you. And it's like, where is the marriage? Well, it's before a certain point in time. I believe it was the 1720s. That there might not be a marriage record. It may not simply existed. It's also kind of interesting to see that there was a time, there's certain ceremonies that people viewed as equivalent to marriage. The church might disagree, but the community didn't. They thought it was okay, acceptable. It's like, well, this couple has demonstrated that they are going to be committed to each other, so we're going to view them as husband and wife, and that their offspring is as legitimate. So you can't just assume that because the child is not labeled as illegitimate that they necessarily got technically married, and thus there's a marriage record. Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's like those records you're expecting to find not existing because there wasn't a legal requirement, technically. Anyways, and then there's difference in calendars, and calendars can interpret why somebody's stating they were so many days old. Sometimes you get some really precise death records where it's like they were something years old, so many weeks or months, and so many days, and you do the math and you're like, that doesn't, and you have your birth record, they don't line up, but you consider a calendar change that was made, and suddenly the numbers line up again, like, oh, yeah. So, they were aware of the calendar change. They did state it correctly. You just forgot that they had, you as a modern observer failed to take into account that there was a calendar change in their lifetime. So the Great Calendar Problem. So this is one most dates are really important. Particularly genealogists get obsessed when there's a discrepancy. We have to try to either figure out why it isn't really a discrepancy, or or you can chalk it up to something else. You have to be able to explain that error away. But Sweden has a really unique calendaring system. So 1699, late 1699, they decide that we need to switch from I'm not speaking as a Swede. I'm a natural born in the USA genealogist that happens to have a love, appreciation for Swedish research and has trained themselves to do it and to gain some familiarity with the language, its culture and history. Anyways, so the great switch between the calendars that most of Europe was doing. A lot of places would just simply jump forward the number of days they needed to catch the calendars up, to get back on with the actual time. That they had determined that the calendar has fallen behind versus solar time, calendar, solar days versus the calendar. Anyways, there's a history to it. Sweden's response was very unique. So they had a very unique period where they were basically on their own little island. They had to fix that. They had the system where they were trying to do it one step at a time. But I probably just move on to the next slide because this requires some context. All right, so basically there was basically in November 1699, as mentioned, the Swedish government decided to adopt the Gregorian calendar, departing from the Julian calendar that had been used for many years, since the days of the Romans, at least. But instead of doing what most countries did, skipping the extra days all at once, Sweden decided they wanted to do it gradually. The plan was to skip leap days for the periods of 1700 to 1740, slowly catching up to the Gregorian calendar over 40 years. That started in 1700 by skipping the leap day. So far so good at that point. But then the Great Northern War broke out. Just to let you know, the idea of getting everybody to consistently do this so there wasn't chaos took a lot of bureaucratic work. So there was a war. The war broke out, and it was a long war. And they forgot to skip the leap days in 1704 and 1708. So now Sweden was on this awkward calendar that was one day ahead of the Julian calendar, but still 10 days behind the Gregorian. So they're on their own calendar. Nobody's calendar's off. I know a day might not sound like that big of a deal, but that can matter if you have a contemporaneous event being reported by different people. You might want to know why Sweden's is off by a day, by a number of days. That's different than everybody else's math. That's why. So then in January 1711, King Charles XII declared that Sweden would abandon that failed experiment, return to the Julian calendar instead. So in order to do that, they had to go back one day. They'd skipped in 1700. So since 1712 was already a leap year, they added an extra day to February, creating February 30th, 1712. So, and I actually have somebody on my direct lines family groups that they were born on this 30th of February. So that's exciting. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it, and all the date checking software that I plugged that into says that can't be right. That is not a real date. I'm like, well, it was for Sweden. Only Sweden on that day. Only that day was there February 30th legitimately. So that wasn't, anyways. So, eventually Sweden did finally adopt the Gregorian calendar properly in 1754, right around the time that England did so. They did so, they did it likewise by skipping 11 days from February 17th and that day was immediately followed by March the 1st. So what does that mean? So any Swedish record dated between March the 1st in 1700 and February 30th, 1712 is on this very unique Swedish calendar, and any record before 1753 is on the Julian calendar, 10 to 11 days behind dates in countries that already adopted the Gregorian system. So you're trying to correlate a Danish, German, or English record from this period, you've got to account for that on your calendar, or you're going to mismatch things. Although, what situation is that going to affect you from a genealogy standpoint? Particularly if you're only doing inter-kingdom research, probably not. But it's good to know this. And if you're ever hoping to become an accredited professional, or anybody, anyways, if you probably be asked about this calendaring thing, and you better be able to give them the correct answer. This is the correct answer, or you will sound very ignorant. All right, so what about these feast days? All right, so another problem. What's a feast day? For the uninitiated, um, so this is something that dates back from the universal Catholic or Catholic period, where everybody was part of the church, as it was called, before the Reformation happened. There was a big emphasis placed on by the clergy on feast days. This was how they kept track of time. It was everything. There was a bunch of these feasts, these saint days dedicated to, not necessarily you're going to have, you're going to go eat out and gorge yourself. Although some of these days you would specifically celebrate really major events, but most of these were just special days dedicated to different saints. And there was tons of them. And there was all these religious holidays and milestones. So, and these are what really, this is what mattered to the clergy, and how they measured out their time was in relation to these feast days, compared to the secular calendars, which had months with Roman pagan origins. So that's why they probably weren't big fans of dating their stuff like that, because it was too pagan for their liking. So they just used their own system. Eventually they relented for practical reasons. But anyways, so Swedish clergy and a lot of other clergy throughout Europe would do this, sometimes writing in Latin, sometimes in Swedish, their local language, vernacular languages. Lots of abbreviations exist. So instead of saying the 15th of March for 1 year, let's say there might be one where it says it's 3 Sundays before Easter, if there's not already a feast day already associated with that, or reference a saint day like Michaelmassin, which is Michaelmas, which is September 29th on a particular year, and not to be confused with All Saints Day or Michael's All Ladies Ladies Day or whatever. All Saints Day is a different holiday. Sorry, I'm confusing the holidays. So all these days they fell under 2 categories. There was a fixed feast date like Michaelmas or Annunciation Day, Varfrodagen, our Maiden's Day, March 25th, which converts to the same day every year. It's also happened to be the day on a lot of the English calendars when the New Year started. A lot of places that was New Year's. So every day. And so, but then there was some feasts tied to Easter, and Easter itself was calculated from the lunar cycle, and it varied. So there's the complication. Unique Swedish problem. So Sweden used the astronomical Easter calculation from 1740 to 1844. Although by 1844, you don't really get a lot of feast days recorded at that point in most records you encounter. So you probably would never, that wouldn't be a problem once you get into the 1800s. Nevertheless, there are tables that have been published that go up to that point for the very few stubborn holdouts that would actively use that. Just in case you do see that on a record, you can translate it. This occasionally produces a different Easter date than the Gregorian Easter used elsewhere in Protestant Europe. So let's say you find a date in Easter, say, 1805, you probably are not going to have, this is just an example I randomly produced, probably say 1745. It's going to fall on a different calendar date than you could calculate with a standard Gregorian Easter-based feast date table. So your German feast date converter is not going to really work. But luckily, there's this thing called the FamilySearch.org research wiki that has a conversion table for Sweden in particular, and also Norway and Denmark. But you really need to look at those and pull up those particular ones. There's books that have been published that those dates were extracted from, and much more user-friendly and easier to look up than having to go through a book, personally. So names. So this isn't, I'm not sure this is like really a history thing, but a lot of people get confused by the fact that there are periods of time where names seem to change a lot. You have to naming conventions trip everybody up because Sweden naming practice changed dramatically over the centuries, and there was also a lengthy period of time where certain, like, only people that were allowed to have more than one given name were non-peasants pretty much, up until like the 1800s. You really don't see, so if you're like clear back in the 1700s or maybe the really early 1800s, and you know somebody that has multiple given names, it's an automatic clue that they are something quite remarkable. And actually, this is kind of a rule for a lot of Europe. So when somebody's listed on somebody has a pedigree chart where somebody has more than one given name, particularly like back in like the 1600s, like even like in the United States, I raised my eyebrows and I'm like, probably somebody's conflating two individuals, and that's just their convenient way of trying to resolve that. That's a valid way of resolving the problem in later periods, where sometimes people will use a middle name versus a given name. And this sometimes happens in, say, Germany too, where people would be allowed to have, they usually have Johann first because they were trying to confuse the angel of death. So, fun fact, there's some places where it's common to have more than one. But Sweden, that wasn't a practice. So anyways, as this example, eventually there was a period where patronymics there's also, Scandinavia, you have patronymics, which was used by a lot of people. And there's also, the clergy had different naming systems, the nobility had certain systems. Everybody seemed to have their own rules. So it's important to know these rules. All right, so the patronymic system was the dominant naming practice from medieval times, when people started to feel the need to start distinguishing themselves with surnames of some sort, up through the late 1800s, some regions all the way into the early 20th century. But anyways, you usually see this consistent. It was used amongst day laborers in rural, and also in rural Sweden in general, by most of the population up until about the 1860s, where we start to see a transition to a more traditional uh, or traditional from the viewpoint of the rest of the world, Western, European world. One second, need the light on. It's getting dark in here. Where we start seeing the use of fixed surnames, but it's a gradual process. There were some laws that occurred that strongly encouraged people to start taking up fixed inheritable surnames. So we start seeing people starting to adopt surnames when they get married for their husbands. Start seeing that around the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s. You often get to see this in the household records, where people start choosing these names for themselves, and writing that down as to what their preferences were. It's really interesting to see that change take place. In case you're not familiar with how the patronymic system works in Sweden, I know like in some places they don't put the sons and daughters on it, like say in the Welsh patronymic or the Dutch patronymic systems, or other places where you have patronymics. You have in Sweden you have the SON and DOTTER for daughter versus datter or sen, or SEN for son, and DATTER as you see as in Norway and Denmark, and Iceland. Basically everybody except Sweden or Swedish influenced. So a lot of Finnish records will have that, because Swedish was the predominant language used for record keeping up until like the 1870s. Fun fact, even after they separated from, well, I wouldn't say separated, they were ceded to as a Grand Duchy to the Russian, to Imperial Russia. Anyways, so a woman can never become a son technically, although eventually in dropping the daughter custom, you do see some cases where it does, but that's just a transition just to standardization, where daughter was being formally dropped as they were trying to standardize. So anyways, you also see people taking on surnames of like military surnames that hadn't been family hereditary before, but if you're being pressed to, some people wanted to take on that surname. Anyway, that's another practice. So that's one thing you have to remember with surnames. Surnames are like, it might be possible that there's a relationship, like maybe there's a sibling relationship between two Andersons, or Anders daughter, Anderson, but you can't use that as, because there's so many different Anders running around that could have been each person's respective parents. That requires a much higher burden of proof. Oh yeah, so then there's also some exceptions. Farm names and Dalarna, the famous Dalarna horses, painted horses. That's actually modern day. Older records. It's Kupabore. Dalarna is the name of the landscape. It's a very old name. That's now the name of the place. Now let's see that general region. Illegitimate children, it's a whole different mix. Sometimes you have matronymics where the father truly was unknown, and they didn't decide to use a maternal grandfather's name instead. So if you find somebody where you'd say you have like the illegitimate child shows up as Svensson, there's no explanation, there's no Sven component in the immediate pedigree of the mom. Maybe they knew something about their dad that only got told to them, and that didn't get transmitted. There's also, it's useful. It's kind of a bit of a clue, but you have to be very careful when you look at the name of an illegitimate child. Sometimes I've seen adopting of somebody, they became often a lot of illegitimate children were put in as foster children, and if that family had their own surname, like a non-patronymic name, they would just assume that. I've seen that happen before. So you have to be very careful making assumptions about relationships based off of surnames, unless it's a priest name, and in usually that case there's a good chance that that was only by family, or a noble name, because there was a lot of protection against noble names being assumed by commoners. So if you know if it has a heraldry association, there's likely going to be a family connection there, because that can just be randomly assumed by a tradesman, or so. Also, tradespeople would take them on too. Soldiers would take them on. I'm probably getting ahead of myself, so I probably should skip forward. All right, I was getting a bit ahead of myself. So beyond patronymics, there's basically two other major categorizations. There's interpretive traps that can be created. There's soldier names and nature names. So there's a very unique institution of the soldier names because of the Swedish allotment system, the Indelningsverket, which was acted by military act passed by the Swedish Parliament on October 27, 1682, under King Charles XI. It grouped farms into units called rotors, wards is a common translation, and each rote supplied one soldier, and these soldiers were given distinctive names to tell them apart, because in a company of men, half of them might be, Anders Johansson or Anders Andersson. So soldiers' names often had something, described characters that they were hoping to instill in military, like modig meaning brave, rask meaning brisk, frisk meaning healthy, for weapons, sabel for saber, and lance for lance, skjold for shield. These names are often followed the name of the cottage, or named after the cottage. Are wrote themselves. So they typically follow the cottage rather than the soldier. So when a soldier gets replaced, the discharged one might inherit the same soldier name. There might not be any relationship whatsoever. So two people with a soldier name in the 1700s or even later doesn't mean jack squat unless you can prove that there is a relationship. All you know is they probably served from the same spot. So anyways, you can usually track those. And there's nature names like Lindgren, Lindberg, that's Linden or branch. Linden or Gren is branch. Berg, mountain. Strom is stream. These were very popular in the 19th century. Swedes were transitioning. They would often adopt these names. A lot of craftsmen would do so as well. When you became a master tradesman or became a journeyman, a lot of people would, to differentiate themselves from a commoner, would take these names as well, because they didn't want to have an ordinary name when they had extraordinary skill. So, which can sometimes get you stuck if you don't know their patronymic name before then, so you would know when you're looking in birth records what their father was. Anyways, there's about 1850 to 1920s where this period is very treacherous for name interpretations, and there are often times where siblings of the same family choose to take on different surnames. So you have one person who's using a patronymic one that would come from their father, or they take their father's surname they were doing, or they might adopt a nature name. Children of soldiers might use their father's soldier names, which they weren't historically inheritable until about like the mid 1800s when people started to carry them, like my ancestors did with the soldier name, where it was started to be allowed to be passed on to the kids. So anyways, it was just there's a lot of variables here, And the idea of a father-son, sharing the same military surname, sharing the same units, it happens, but it's less common than it's common to the point you need to prove it with additional documentation before you can reach that conclusion. Anyways, this is sponsored by Hegman and Family Search Wiki, and and my research experience over the years. So basically, then there's in 1901, Sweden passed the name ordinance, the Släktnamnsförordningen, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Sorry, not Dane, Swedes. This was adopted the 5th of December, 1901. This was commonly described as a law that ended patronymics, but this is a misconception that's been addressed. It didn't ban it. It basically contained rules for adopting family names, but it did not include obligation to adopt them, did not prohibit the continued use of patronymics. What it did was it was to regulate the previously informal and completely free right to adopt family names, formalizing a process that had already been happening socially for decades. So that's basically what it was. It was just, you also see I think one of the biggest things you would see in family name spelling conventions is in 1905 or so, with the legal spelling reforms. This is where you start to see, you get a lot of archaic ways of spelling names get phased out. There's a lot of rules of, the standard, book print forms of Swedish that you see now. That's when that really officially started to become a thing, and names followed suit. And with that, a lot of names became standardized, and that's when people started to get a lot more obsessed with spelling, and where the spelling tends to be a lot more consistent than it was before. So after that point, how it shows up in official records tends to be the same spelling from then on out. Typically, I tend to notice spelling becomes way more. So then there's the Names Act of 1963. So going way into the 20th century, this is when citizens are finally forced, that haven't already done so, to use a family name. So anybody who was still a holdout, even though most people by the 1920s had already, even in the rural parts, had adopted, there were still some stubborn holdouts. This was there's some bureaucratic reasons why. Well, you had a lot of central registers and things, and people not conforming. Patronymics did not work well with early computer systems, so you had to put a kibosh to people being rebels, I guess. So basically it was outlawed officially by 1966, and that, according to some, by the Swedish American genealogist, and this is when it officially was enforced with the transitional provision following the 1963 Act. So all the way up to 1963 to 66, there's people that could still have used patronymics, but most people weren't by that point. So anyways, so the land that moved, well, it wasn't the land that moved, it was how it was distributed, and how you said that you owned a piece of property, what the boundaries and consistency of that property was. So I guess the land moved under your feet, as it were. There was 3 really massive reforms of land redistribution from the 1750s up to the 1820s. That reorganized the Swedish countryside, created a whole category of records, including detailed maps, which not all genealogists know even exist, because it's often filed on a free government website. It's kind of it can be a pain to navigate, but if you know how to navigate the map function, you can find a lot of useful treasures that might not be found anywhere else. So the families, what made this interesting is that some people were physically moved. Like, so before these reforms, Swedish farm villages were organized under a medieval strip farming system. A single farmer might have dozens of tiny scattered strips of land spread across the village's fields. And it was kind of an accident. It was generations of inheritance where you just subdivide people's properties and they take strips and sell to different people, and it got very convoluted. And it was very inefficient, and that was the top reason the government was worried about it. Was because it started to make growing crops unproductive because people couldn't easily work on in fields, and then people had to walk over people's stuff, and you had to make pathways between all these fields. So it reduced the land's, the arable land's efficiency. So that's when the government was worried. And because of that, it reduced the ability for the population to feed itself, and most importantly, to be able to pay taxes. So there was a money consideration here. And that's why the government was really concerned. Money. So the Great Division started with the 1749 Land Survey Ordinance. It was formalized in a 1757 decree, which began consolidating strips into larger blocks. So basically, it was recorded you had a certain amount of property. We're just taking these strips, these various people's strips, and putting them into more manageable, easier to work, larger blocks. So this produced approximately 40,000 maps, and these have been scanned and are available through the Landsmateriet Historical Maps portal. Then there was a division of 1803, further aiming to give each farmer a single continuous piece of land. This forced some farmers to physically relocate from a village center, because people would have all their houses in one spot and their fields and throughout, and they would have these numbered farms. Like, your farm number what? And your house might be somewhere completely different than the land you're on, but that was just the common lands. So anyways, it was introduced after. Particularly, this really affected particularly the southern part of the country in Skåne. Rudiger Mackelin structured land on his Svanholm estate in 1785. So anyways, the nobility. So then there was the Lagaskrifta in 1827 that replaced both the reforms. And then, so there's an article by Stefan Helmsfrid in 1961 in the Geographica Annular that remains the definitive scholarly overview of all three of these reforms in the English language. I mean, for genealogists, these reforms matter because they generated extraordinarily detailed maps showing every farm, every boundary, and some of the later, particularly on the later ones, every farmer's names that were in play, particularly those who owned the lands, including some tenants as well, but a lot of it particularly mentioned owners, and sometimes the documents themselves will mention. We'll talk about the history of when each piece of property was obtained. So there's a lot of valuable information that you probably won't get anywhere else. So if you want to know if your person owned land at that time, particularly in the 1800s, where it hasn't been, the court records haven't been indexed, it's a great place to look. Let's see. So there's likely a map or even support. Besides the maps, there's often something that's not often known. Is attached to those maps are supporting documents with them that can be quite lengthy and detailed, that talk about the surveying and disputes they may have had, because there was some property lines where people just were used to ambiguity and they didn't really care, or they weren't sure, and And this is when a lot of places were forced to say, well, where's the line really? And they couldn't tell you, so somebody had to make a declaration. They had to go through the process of going through, people's individual documentation, the court records to figure it out, and hammer out those ambiguities that had crept in over centuries or decades. Because there's one of those things where people hadn't had a problem, hadn't disputed or even thought about whether or not, like, where was the line really? People just thought something was the line, but they couldn't prove it. It's really interesting to hear people have to say, we don't have documentation. There was a stone here, but that stone's no longer visible or glossed, or that's just tradition. We don't know for sure, and they had to make legal decisions about where people's properties began and ended. So, because that's one thing you find with a lot of these land records, like they don't often specify the metes and bounds. They just mention a piece of property, and the boundaries were just made up with boundary stones and whatnot, and people just accepted that the people's land began and ended at certain points. And it wasn't only until there was problems that we even bothered to have surveys. Definitely wouldn't do that today. But that was just, they just had a different way of thinking about things. And if they didn't think that something was a big enough deal to bring up to court, particularly if two properties were owned by people who had been friendly with each other's families for generations, it wasn't a big deal until they were until they got confronted by government officials and forced to realize, like, hey, this turns out we don't really know. Anyways, language and jurisdiction. So there's some parts of modern-day Sweden that once belonged to other countries, its neighbors. So there's changes there. So there's parts of Sweden that were formerly from Denmark and Norway. There's some islands like Åland, and Gotland, particularly Gotland. Gotland was held by Denmark for a long time. And there's quite a few records out there where basically when Sweden took over, they had to do these major surveys to figure what in the heck do we own? And because they just didn't have clear records from the Danes about what was owned by who, it's just people had just accepted, or the records just really weren't existent or carefully kept. So they had to do these surveys about who owned the land and get some history down on these properties, so they could establish themselves and work under the Swedish system going forward on a solid foundation. It's interesting seeing regime changes having to, they're used to one standard, and the other system, the previous regime, didn't have the same standards. And so you have to go and try to get everybody up to your standards so you can move forward without controversy. So I call this Swedification. So there's one of the most major treaties was the Treaty of Roskilde in 1658, which transferred Skåne, Bonakriga, and Holland lands from Denmark to Sweden. Then there was the Treaty of Brimsømmerbro in 1645 that transferred Jämtland and Härjedalen and Gotland from Denmark, Norway, the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway. They were sharing the crown, and Bohusland came from Norway in 1658. These territory transfers didn't just reach other boundaries; they fundamentally changed the administrative, linguistic, and even some of the religious infrastructure of these regions. Even though these regions were Lutheran themselves, there's still a transition from the different churches. You had basically, you might fundamentally agree on stuff, but how you did your business, it was still new ownership. Your boss just changed. If you were a priest of these parishes, the bishops you were answering to archbishops just fundamentally changed. And that was an adjustment period. So for people living there, the records were now being kept by a different government in a language that was gradually shifted. Particularly it's to be noted that the 1645 transfer was way more peaceful and gradual and congenial than what happened with the 1658 transfers. Well, it ended up being a lot. That ended up in a lot more. One was much nicer. The crown was much nicer and tolerant for one versus the other. And the other one surprisingly wasn't surprised that the change of ownership with the latter 1658 transfers ended in revolts that plagued the ensuing decades with rebels and guerrilla fighters that Sweden had to deal with, and lots of stuff got destroyed in that process. So, particularly in Skåne, anyways. So you basically had this shift from administration reported to Stockholm rather than Copenhagen. So for places that were in like the former Danish territories, some places had church records dating back to 1646 when there was a law nationally, kingdom-wide, demanding records to be kept by the Danes. And also they might even have some earlier probates, because in 1684 that was mandated. Do all those survive? Sadly, no. Relatively few have, unfortunately, at least in my experience. But in these areas, it's possible to have records from the prior regime that might still exist. Some of these, sometimes they're still found in Riksarkivet. Others somehow are still filed in the Norwegian or Danish archives still, even though they haven't been a part of that kingdom for centuries. It just all depends on where the paperwork got filed before the transitions and handoffs occurred. And there's just so many variables. So sometimes you see a mixture of Danish and Swedish, which honestly, when you're back in the 1600s, the differences aren't usually that much. So usually if you can read one, you can probably make a good sense. Sometimes there's some slightly different vocabulary for certain terms, but usually phonetically, it's usually you can interpret them. It's not usually a big handicap. So it kind of depends on the background of your person and how fast they adapted to Swedish standards, particularly in language. It's a bit of a culture shock, but it wasn't too much. So who got recorded? So when it comes to church records, there's one theme. It's like who got recorded, who didn't. So I do tend to have a presentation where I talk more about particular groups and people that did not appear. But it'd be an insult not to bring up these major events and factors. So the Swedish state church maintained a near total monopoly on vital registration for many centuries. If you weren't Lutheran, you were either invisible in the records or recorded under duress. So understanding these exclusions is essential for interpreting what you find and more importantly what you don't find. So essentially between 1593 to 1860, Sweden was strictly a Lutheran-only nation. The Uppsala Synod of 1593 established Lutheranism as the sole legal religion. So anyways, by the Church of Sweden's own history, they say that by then Sweden was a monolithic religious state, allowing only Swedish version of the evangelical faith. Yep, that's from the horse's mouth. So the Church Law of 1686, the same law that mandated parish record keeping effective 1688, defined Sweden as an evangelical nation and required all Swedes to confess the evangelical faith. The Conventicle Act of 1726 went further, banning all religious meetings outside the Lutheran State Church, with the sole exemption of family prayer, which they had to do because during the Great Northern War, there was a lot of prisoners of war captured and taken to Russia, and a lot of them got very religious in their boredom and started developing followings. There was a lot of citizen preachers that came back after that, and they started to get followings of their own, and that's technically that became a problem because some of them had some extremist views in the eyes of the state, so they basically banned that. Like, you could only meet inside a church, and it had to be presided by the minister. No other official meetings counted. So that was obviously a problem as evangelical. This wasn't a problem for a while until you started to get missionaries from other denominations coming in around the early 1800s, particularly when Denmark started adopting religious tolerance laws in the 1840s. Missionaries that were coming in from like the United States, starting in Denmark, would start visiting in Sweden, and it was ugly. Very, very, very ugly. But 1860, the Censure Acts of 1860 and 1873 finally allowed citizens to leave the official church and join another officially recognized denomination. But conversion was still hedged by strong restrictions. So, unlike a lot of places, the Swedish state did not begin keeping its own separate secular vital records until 1950. So, when it was possible to fully leave, you could join another church, but you were not allowed to leave the church officially. You can entirely withdraw your name off the records. That was not allowed. So even these vital records, you might be wondering, this is when you start seeing the estate official vital rolls that they started keeping. So the church continued to maintain church responsibility for everybody up till 1991. That means that if you're working even before 1950, church records are civil records, and even those civil records I've never personally encountered. They haven't even been unlocked officially yet because they're still in the law of secrecy, so I've never seen them personally myself. I've only read about their existence. So even then, most of the time you have every decade you have these published transcribed basically census records that have all that data anyways. It's actually from these official, they have this ongoing roll system that if you're to file for a birth certificate, now they don't have them, you're just basically getting a certified copy of your entry on the national population database is pretty much what they do. So, fun fact, you do have some dissenter records, like Baptist, Methodist, LDS. They do exist, but most people are going to still appear in the Lutheran records, even with derisive notes about how they've warned these people, these dissenters, and tried to preach repentance to them. I have seen this to trigger a lot of immigration, particularly with my ancestors. One of them left in the 1850s before the Tolerance Act, so his life was in jeopardy. Everybody's life was in jeopardy, so they left. It wasn't a hard sell to go up to the Rocky Mountains because their own people were trying to kill them, so I don't frankly blame them. But they do have their own records, but I've seen one instance where somebody didn't get their children registered because you had to still check in, and they made the Lutheran Church made it as awkward as possible for those dissenters when they checked in. They hassled them, gave them a hard time, tried to get them to rejoin or renounce their new faiths. So one case I had a client who had an ancestor whose birth they were born like some months before the family left, but they never checked in with anybody. Nobody ever got their kid's birth reported. So the first record of existence for this child, their ancestor, is the passenger list, and their birth date comes from basically family record. And them saying they were born in that place, but I have no record of them. But that's because it was a big city and nobody reported that birth. It happened, but very, 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 very rarely. And even then and then on top of a lot of these dissenter records, a lot of them, this preservation is sporadic because they were persecuted, and branches were dissolved and abandoned at times, and the records didn't always get transferred or deposited in their respective sex official archives. So a lot of it has been lost to history. I've seen cases where I've done some research of people, LDS people that would join. The only record we have is the immigration company, the faith's immigration company records. It's the only official acknowledgement, because then this person went and split off and didn't even get all the way across to the Rocky Mountains. They got to Kansas City it was Omaha, and split off and joined another Swedish immigrant family that wasn't of that faith. And it was interesting, but the only official we know that they said that they were baptized according to obituaries, but we don't have those records anymore. And it's basically only those immigration records that even give us any official clue that they were formerly members at one point. So that's a really interesting chapter there. And that might be jumping ahead a bit, but that's something to think about. There's some groups like gypsies that weren't allowed at all, penalty of death, there's some groups that weren't allowed in the country at all. Jews were highly restricted. They weren't really allowed to come into the country until about 1780, and under really strict provisions. And they could not be in the Lutheran Church. They had their own congregation records. Congregations are mandated to be with, and those records only exist there unless they converted to Christianity. But in that case, that's one of the very few exceptions you see before the 1950s of groups that are entirely not in the church records that were legally allowed to live in the country. So I did speak much about this before. Moving records still existed, although you must less likely get certificates out of these places from them. But if you're trying to comply with the law, particularly if you're moved before 1860, the thing is you didn't have any legal rights if you had joined another church. So that's something to think about. Somebody that joins after 1860 is in a completely different boat than somebody who joins before 1860. Anyways, so you have to check both, is the long and short of it. Church had the legal duties still to keep everybody listed. But anyways, there was church histories document a Swedish pastor composed of prayer writing churches naming those who left the church during the Latter-day Saints. You often have household books will mention somebody when they join the church. And some birth registers, because of the baptism, if you're a Baptist or a Latter-day Saints who didn't believe in infant baptisms, you would say that the kid wasn't baptized. But then there'd be notations not baptized. If you have a whole family with their kids not baptized, they're probably dissenters, and usually this faith gets spelled out in the records. They usually identify them specifically: Baptist or Mormon. Um, they're very blunt about it. But anyways, there's all sorts of stuff about the persecutions I've read about, particularly the Latter-day Saints. So they had some Swedish pastors compose a prayer that for people publicly identifying them under the pretense of praying for them, which led to shunning and threats. Very clever about that. There was individuals that appeared because the minister was legally required to track them. So basically, you have to look at them both to give a complete picture of what they were doing. It's not easy, and honestly, you have to give regardless of what you believe about the respective faiths, you have to get these people. Anybody who dissented from the state church was very brave or very foolish, depending how you want to think of it. I like to think of it as being very brave to say that you disagreed and that you wanted to follow what you believe to be the truth. And yeah. And fun fact that the church for the LDS church, for the Latter-day Saints, there was official government sanctioned campaigns of fighting the faith's expansion and state-sponsored distribution of anti Latter-day Saint materials and whatnot. So that faith was particularly punished. These others, the ones, they were still punished too, but the Mormons got the particular brunt of the wrath of society and of the government and the church. Before 1816, you didn't have legal rights if you were particularly if you were a foreign missionary. The mobs could beat you to death, and the law would do nothing to intervene. So just because you're recorded doesn't mean you were recognized as an equal. So then there's history that erases records, or I wouldn't say erases. Sometimes there's a lot of things that don't get written down, particularly mass death events, where there's just so many people who died that it just wasn't possible to keep track of them all. Something that's not talked about enough when the records don't exist, that there's some events that kill people so quickly that record-keeping systems don't keep up. Think of every plague, every major battle. You have like a peasant revolt, rebellion. You can't possibly record all those deaths, be certain of who died, because somebody goes out and joins. You don't know if they just ran away or they died. So you can't just write up a death record for them, right? So nor can you issue a moving, say that they moved, because you're not sure what happened to them. You can't say you issued a formal moving certificate for them because you didn't. So anyways, there's multiple mass mortality events that disrupted record continuity and sometimes depopulated entire farms and villages. And they had to recruit people, particularly in early, in the 1600s. So sometimes it's not just simply lost records, just the record may have never been produced in the first place. So plagues, wars, famines. So here's a couple of major events. Just some. There's a lot of local events. There's economic problems like the 1800s, like the 1860s, that triggered a lot of Swedes to emigrate. So you have the Black Death. Now, technically, the plagues, this period, it took hundreds of years to recover from this. But if you're back that far, there's chances are that the farm occupied before that time versus after, it's going to be different folks. You have great famines in the late 1600s, which definitely probably affects a lot of people. So there's a lot of deaths that don't get recorded that way. So if there's sudden changes in occupants and there's no death records when there was records kept. Sometimes you can tell that when you look at a parish register and there's just a huge amount of people that are buried within a very short period of time. You just know they're very overwhelmed, and often the details in those entries are very scant, if at all. Sometimes you just get a child from a place got buried, like they just got overwhelmed, like, or that there was an event where somebody died along with all of their family. Like one person's named, and they say like, well, the rest, like almost all their family save this, save like one or two individuals died at this time, like rapidly. Like you see that, it's like, oh my gosh, like for sure, like even though, and then you look at the pedigree, you have records for the rest of the family, but there's no death record for them. But you just know from one person's record that whole family was wiped out at that time, that none of them survived. Like that's incredible. That's one instance I saw where I was fortunate enough because somebody, yeah, like that's incredible. And then there's the Great Northern War where even though you had the allotment system, there was still lots of conscription. There's definitely periods of conscription. There's lots of battlefield deaths that are unrecorded. Conscript records basically have largely not survived from what I understand. So those people were largely not written down like you were to be an allotment soldier. So you're not going to find records of them dying. So home parish, usually they disappeared. Like what happened to them? They could have just died. If you have somebody where they would have been fighting age that time period, and you cannot find a record of them moving or dying, maybe this is what happened to them. They got conscripted and they died in a foreign battlefield. Allotment soldiers, you might be lucky enough to get records of them dying in a foreign battlefield and being talked about that way, like I had with one of my ancestors. But if you're a conscript, the odds of you having a record is very low. You were very, very, very low on the totem pole, and records just weren't really a habit to be kept. I've heard of some, but they're very hard to search, and they're largely undigitized, held at the Krigsarkivet, the war archives. It's not a lot of finding aids for them either, so practically, for all intents and purposes, even if they do exist, you're probably not going to be able to successfully navigate most of them. Then there's the Great Plague of 1610s to 1613. I can just tell you for a fact there's a lot of tax records that don't exist from that time period. It's like, and suddenly that makes a lot of sense when you think about there was a plague. This was like the last plague of Scandinavia. Parish records often were not well kept, and even tax records might not have been kept either. The Montaus registrations might not have, which, if you have to gather people in to keep those and visit people, maybe, emergency measures, you just skip those years. Not bother gathering the facts. That makes sense. Although there's some years where they did record it, some places they don't. So I guess I particularly noticed this, in Skåne, the southernmost part of Sweden. That makes a lot of sense why I don't see a lot of tax records from that time period. See, that's me making some connections. The Scanian War of 1765 to 1769, thereabouts, there were a lot of rebels and a lot of fighting and lots of destruction. Lots. Like there's almost no parish records or court records that exist prior to this era for most places. Most places don't start until after that point. And no wonder, it was brutal. And they were still hunting down the guerrillas and rebels even they were still prosecuting people even into like 1700 for this period of history. It was very bloody. And you shouldn't be surprised that farms got depopulated at that time. And then there's the Russian coastal raids, of Norrköping and Södertälje, coastal towns of that particular part of Sweden, of kind of where largely many places were destroyed. So a lot of physical record destruction from that time period. So if you've lost if your parish register starts after that point and you're from that area, there's a reason. A lot of records got destroyed. A lot of court records, a lot of stuff just didn't survive. Luckily, there's these things called renovated transcript copies of the Dome Bookers that were kept on appellate courts that have often survived. Sweden does a lot of redundancy, luckily. Sadly, not for parish registers. They didn't really do that till the 1860s, when a secular statistics bureau required them to be extracted and transcribed and turned in on an annual basis. Wish they would have done that earlier. So, the Black Death kills 1/3 of the population. Many farms sat abandoned, settlements were empty. It really disrupted society. So, but I really doubt you're ever going to go back to the 1300s. Great Famine was bad. So many people died at that time. Many people went unrecorded. Great other wars. There was almost certainly they died on the battlefield. It was not a pretty time. This was the collapse of the Swedish Empire, where the kings there was a very arrogant young king that wanted to prove himself, and initially the war went well, but then it all went south, and a lot of soldiers died. So there was no mechanism to report battlefield casualties back to individual parishes in real time, so you're not going to find out. A lot of people never knew what happened. So anyways, I'm just going ahead and just going through my list here. So there's often alternative records, cathedral records, the Dome Capulets, chapters, the diocese, the state records for tenant farmers. Some of those estate archives predate what's particularly in Skåne, has stuff that's managed to survive, that sometimes even goes back to the Danish period. I saw one states it had the equivalent of their court rolls. You can see the manorial court rules that went back to clear back to the 1620s. So really, for that place, I wish I could have convinced my client to have gone in last digit, to go through and have those volumes digitized and have us look through them. But finding out they existed was really nice. But they do exist. But sometimes you have to get really creative. Tax lists and copies that were transcript copies may have survived. So just because the Härjedalen archive itself, the local judicial district's archive was burned, doesn't necessarily mean everything got lost. Particularly if it was any cases went to the Courts of Appeals, may have gotten up there. So the point is, if you're encountering these rough periods and there's disruptions in records, you shouldn't assume that there's relationships from one tenant or owner to the other. In fact, many histories will talk about, I've read, where they'll say that somebody got recruited from a surrounding farm or even another parish to occupy these other farms. So when there's major events, sometimes people from surrounding areas got specifically recruited to move in so that they wouldn't be empty and unproductive. So there might be no relationship between the two owners, and there might not be an ownership transfer. It may have just been informally, the government says, yeah, sure, just take it over. And they wouldn't have even drawn up the paperwork. So immigration. So up to 1850, when you had to leave, you had to donate to the Navy pension. You had to go get, even up to 1860, you had to get a passport to even move inside the country more than like a day's journey or so. But even then, there were still some legal requirements you needed to fulfill to leave officially. Approximately between the 1850s and 1920s, approximately 1.3 million Swedes left for America. And the Swedish government did not go quietly with that. They strongly protested that move. There's a machinery that they had to try to discourage the immigration by creating paper trails, and there's also evasive tactics people used to try to get around that. So it's kind of it's interesting to read about. So there's the moving certificate. So even back in the 1600s, early 1600s, they started requiring people, merchants, and everybody to start, if they were moving to an area that they weren't known, they needed to have a moving certificate. Particularly if you had to stop by, you were only allowed to travel like a certain amount per day. Like there were speed limits of how fast you could go. You had to visit and you had to stop at these inns, and they would only let you in and provide you help if and lodgings and whatnot if you could present these passports and these papers. So anyways, so they listed destination, family, character. You had to have them. A lot of them, these certificates haven't survived, but some places would keep the certificates and preserve them. Even in some of those date fled back into like the later part of the 1700s. In some places you can flip through them manually before there's even they bothered to keep a register book, which is kind of more like an index to them, where they would write down people who moved in and out. These usually start being preserved by the 1800s. So the immigrant's journey documents process is there's a Hans Hugmans wrote an article about it. There was certificates served as an identity paper, and they were required to purchase an immigrant ticket. So police departments in the Swedish immigrant force checked the regulations were followed, that immigrants were legal immigrants. I'm not always sure if that was entirely what happened. Some people found some creative ways to leave. Regardless, some people got on the boats regardless. Even without them, for some reason, even despite saying that. But here's where it matters. The government actively resisted immigration. There was actually an official Swedish Immigration Commission mandated by the Riksdag, the Diet, Parliament, between 1907 and 1913, trying to reduce immigration. There was a lot of people leaving by then, and that was an economic problem. By 1910, one-fifth of all Swedes had their homes in America, and both conservative and liberal interests saw this as a national crisis. The Church of Sweden in itself was opposed to immigration, and they actively opposed immigration from the 1800s and 1900s. They gave anybody wanting to leave a really hard time. So there's also general prohibition against conscripts immigrating without permission. So by the end of the 1800s, there was some legal required service you had to give before you could exit. You couldn't get that moving certificate, and you couldn't buy a ticket. Of course, that doesn't stop people from going creative ways, temporarily getting work permits to go to Denmark and whatnot, and then hopping on a boat there and leaving, or going through Hamburg or other ways. They got creative. So there's an invasion pattern that was left. And also became such a big problem that some people just left without permission, that they actually created new books of missing people because they had to move their records to somewhere. You couldn't just drop them. So they could, in these books, they get noted if they found out that they moved to America. They would cross them out at that point. So you'll see. So then, So anyways, but there are some evasive tactics. One of the most common ways you could avoid having to get a hard time from your priest was saying that you were going to go to a major port city like Göteborg or Malmö. And when the person was planning to sail for America, they wouldn't even turn in their certificates to the congregation there. They just say they were going to go there, but then they just go and leave. I've seen that happen. Young men would just simply emigrate before reaching military age. Some would leave in stages, so that each separate departure created their own records, but there would be less splash. So anyways, there's lots of records. There's a Swedish Immigrant Institute in Växjö, probably really mispronouncing that, but they produced the EmiWeb database to see where they actually sailed. There's port city cross references with immigrant databases. So it's kind of interesting to see. There's a lot of reasons why people would want a certificate, because it was their official identity paperwork. Anyways, you came to a new country, you wanted to be able to prove who you were. So, land and legal status. So, illegitimacy. So this is a really sensitive topic, but this is a really important one to understand. So just look through this table. I'm sorry for the part that's caught up by this little porthole, but basically the fathers had to confess after 1917, had to confess through formal legal process. There was acknowledgement papers, and 1970, illegitimate children were granted full inherited rights from the father's side, but basically legitimate versus illegitimate effectively disappeared at that point from a legal standpoint. Although the caveat is that the father had to formally acknowledge the child, though. It had to be formally confessed. If you still denied it, you wouldn't get it. Although now with DNA, I mean, basically, you have to be able to prove, or it was either proved or the father said, yeah, that was my kid by that point. But so basically, clear back, King Magnuson's laws in the 1300s, you had, it was basically there was a lot of range of possibilities, but it was spouse, offended parties that had to initiate it. It wasn't automatic, but you could be executed. It all depends on what your spouse wanted and thought was fair, pretty much. So, but then that changes about the 1680s. This is when records start to appear for most people. What happens before then matters less. I do see some people being brought forward beforehand, some accusations of somebody fathering a child brought forward in the court records, but it's more sporadic. So before 1734, ministers had a lot more flexibility to record suspected fathers based off of local knowledge and character witnesses. After that point, the law constrained them from what they could write without formal acknowledgement. But also with that came a lot more legal consequences that have significant matters. So there's the word for illegitimate that you'll see. It's formally defined: a child born out of wedlock, a mother born without betrothal or promise of marriage. Illegitimate children were then barred for guilds, which this is, somebody's in a guild after 1736, they must have been born illegitimate. You had to have proof of legitimate birth to enter as an apprentice, and again to become a master craftsman. And even the master's wife had to be proven to be legitimate of birth. So, and you could not inherit from either one of your parents, even if they were known. So until 1866, where maternal was allowed, and then 1970, very quite recent. yeah, you could inherit from an illegitimate father. Paternity had to be legally confessed, even if the whole parish knew who the father was. The minister couldn't record his name unless he had formally acknowledged. That's why so many entries say father unknown. Doesn't mean that nobody knew, just nobody confessed legally. There's a bribery dynamic. Even if you got dragged into court, a lot of women would not say because they'd be offered to pay the fine in exchange under the table, in exchange for silence. From her perspective, the fine was coming regardless. The man could get away and deny it and get away scot-free. At least she could get some financial help. Or maybe some help later on the man's terms. But men got away a lot, apparently. And as long as they were believed to not be the father, nobody could say that they'd seen them together in a compromising way. The court could absolve them, and that was that. You got nothing. So essentially, it was a private contract. I'll pay your fine if you don't drag me through the mud. This was really a big incentive for if one of the parties was married. And by the way, double adultery was executable too. So you didn't have a lot of incentive to confess if it was a double adultery thing, and if you could sweep it under the rug, you did. Anyways, before 1734, adultery prosecution was at the mercy of the spouse, as I mentioned. The spouse had to initiate. After 1734, the law automatically prosecuted it. Usually, if you weren't executed, it was 20 days on bread and water, which meant a slice of bread and some water. A lot of people didn't live through that. It was just insufficient for a lot of people to survive. This changed confession patterns. Women had even less incentive to name married men, because the legal consequences for both parties became more severe, more automatic. But by 1741, public confession had been abolished, so they didn't have to say out loud who it was at that point. They might maybe quietly confessed in books, but just because the mom said who it was to the priest didn't automatically mean that it would get transmitted to the courts. Sometimes the fines just happened in-house. Sometimes they didn't get dragged as far as the courts, because basically the fine got collected at the court level, so sometimes the church just handled it in-house and never made it to the court. The fine was twice as big for the man than it was for the woman, though. The woman couldn't hide it, was the logic. The man, on the other hand, couldn't, so he needed to pay more. And there was also just differences in... Yeah, anyways. Then in 1778, there's the right to anonymous birth. King Gustav III introduced it because he was tired of signing the death warrants for people that committed infanticide. They were desperate to hide the illegitimate births. They'd give birth in secret, kill the baby. So he was just wanting to allow women to give birth anonymously at hospitals. So that's where you start seeing unknown mother in many cities with hospitals. This lasted up until 1917, when that practice was abolished. So at that point, if you find that case, you better... There are some records in archives where there were sealed notes that do exist that were meant to be read later. So some archivists have opened those up and annotated, cross-referenced where those exist. It all depends. So that's a fun fact. If you encounter that, that's one thing I've heard about. So, but by the mid-19th century, 1 in 10 children born in Sweden were illegitimate. This wasn't a fringe problem. As I have explained, there were a lot of trial marriages, young people. This is the period where a lot of people claimed that the dad was their illegitimate child was the crown prince. It was a very common story. We can't usually substantiate it, though. There was actually formal purging of the royal family, nobility, from some of these records, unbound stuff in the day, so I've heard about. So it's really hard to prove. And their DNA is kind of locked down like Fort Knox. Anyways, and then there's the guilds. So 1846, the guilds are abolished. So you can And then there's complete freedom of trade in 1864 introduced. So after 1864, you being illegitimate wasn't going to be a barrier to you practicing a craft, although the guilds had been in decline for some time before that. There was still a significant social stigma, but there was quite a few illegitimate people back then. So, yeah, particularly those trial marriages. And there was also the practice of night courtship as well. Lots of pregnancies happened. So, something to know. So after about the 1810, the secular punishment for the first and second offenses were abolished. So most people was their first or second offense max before they stopped having illegitimate children, so they'll never show up in court. But even by that point, a lot of people weren't showing up at all. So that pretty much means someone has to be serial, having multiple kids before they show up. And by 1860s, it's been formally abolished. Fornication penalties are gone at that point. And at that point, paternity records by the court are pretty much gone, unless they sue for child support, which these records are largely on index, so it's hard to figure that out. I'm looking forward to the day when those get indexed. I think that will happen someday in the foreseeable future. But even then, 1917 is a really big year. That's about the time. That's the time when you have civil divorces, adoptions, because all you could do was be a foster child at best. There wasn't formal adoption, really. It wasn't really a thing. That's when the paternity acknowledgement papers were introduced, and anonymous births ended. So, fun facts. So, finding the father. There's some strategies here. So before 1741 is the richest because there's public confession, and the absolution list who had to do public penitence, and that's often where illegitimacies are recorded. Church accounts would show where fines are paid. Critical research tips look for a man who finds double the amount the woman who was fined at the same court session. That was a suspected father. And sometimes even if the father doesn't get charged by the court, the church could still do so if they really felt like the father hadn't been truthful. And so, fun fact. You could get off scot-free from the court, but still be fined by the church. So then between 1741 and 1810, that's where the court record period's important. The Dome Book or the court minutes are your best friend. Good thing is now a lot of these records are now indexed up to 1800. At least the transcript copies. We're starting to see more of the local Herods. So anyways, they're not the court records are chronological. There's not an index. There's a record of fines that usually follows the court minutes, but it only counts if there was a fine involved. If there was a criminal outcome, you're not going to be on the fine list, or civil ruling, only if a fine is out. So anyways. So there's the difficult middle period between 1810 and 1864. So it just gets really hard to find. But usually you just follow the court records looking for any clues. I may check to see if the child got legitimized when the mother married, which means the father acknowledged the paternity. And I've seen cases where the father's name gets written in pencil in the parish register after the father formally acknowledges paternity. I've seen it happen before. But then usually see abbreviations. There's some abbreviations. SFAK, son before Akenskap, son before marriage. DF, daughter before Akenskap, daughter before marriage, might appear in the marriage entry itself. So it's a name game. This is really practical. It's common for illegitimate sons receiving the same first name as their biological father. So it's like name Johann. It's like they weren't. It's like that was a way. It's like, well, it's named after his dad. Anyways, Also other things like where the child's registered as Lars and Lars' daughter, but the mother's father isn't Lars. Look for the man named Lars working on the same farm or same household or a surrounding area. It's not proof, but it's a strong lead. After 1864, you really need DNA. At that point, parish notes and subsequent legitimization becomes the only documentary paths. There's some suits for child support, but they're hard to find right now. Again, there's that bribery dynamic. You have the public accumulation on top of it. The private deal was often rational. You're more likely to get support that way, and so in that case, so that explains why even periods when the courts were actually pursuing paternity, in most cases never generated the records. There was a deal that got made in advance beforehand that prevented it from going forward. So that's that. There are summons lists, by the way, where they might get a summons and that might have triggered a deal under the table. All right, so record standardization, just a quick tie together. So before 1686, there's no national mandate for record keeping, as I mentioned. There was a Bishop Johannes Rudbachius in Västerås that instructed ministers in his diocese to begin recording names and vital records as early as 1622, creating some of the earliest household examinations you'll find in Swedish records. But it's not until like 1688, 1689 that you start seeing centralized instruction and keeping. But by 1860, that's when you get standardized printed forms were introduced. But before then, it was up to individuals what they were going to do. Often there wasn't printed books, except for the household books for some dioceses, and some places would produce them, but the parish registers themselves, it was entirely up to them how they would keep it. But then in 1894, there was a major change where there was kingdom-wide standardization. All the books are exactly the same, and there's these column translation book that you can apply to the whole kingdom. That just makes it easy. But before then, you have to be able to read Swedish to a degree to know what the columns are saying. So, fun fact. So key takeaways: 1700 to 1754, conversion's mandatory for cross-border correlation because they were their own brand of special at that time. Names were fluid. People use all sorts of variants. I didn't even cover the fact that Per, Petter, Jons, Johan, Johannes, Jonas. Then there's Liskin for Elizabeth. There's all sorts of variants, and people use them very interchangeably. It was basically up to the whim of the record keeper as to what version got written down. There's land reforms to be aware of. Some places, particularly in the early periods, where where parts of the kingdom got ceded from other kingdoms. You might have to look at those other records from those archives. Church monopoly before 1860. It's going to be comprehensive by default. I haven't even talked about gypsies and the Sami. That's an interesting chapter of Swedish history. Really controversial, and that's a whole other presentation. Mass mortality events created gaps where there might be records that were never created because there just was too much going on to make them. Moving certificates stating their destination doesn't always say where they actually go. Sometimes they pick a different place anyways, so you always check the court records if you can. Father unknown just kind of means unconfessed after 1734. Might not mean that they were entirely unknown. So there's other records you need to check. All right, so what you know can help you. So here's some sources I've cited, just some of them. Some further reading. Sweden Portal has a lot to read, lots of history, a lot of books out there, a lot of guides that you can read. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. This is a really long presentation, but I think this is really the meat and potatoes of understanding Swedish genealogy, is understanding the very critical historical laws before then. Particularly for 1734, you just have to understand what exists before and after is so different. Legally, like what kind of probate records were kept. There's just huge changes, like the difference of legal standards before and after are massive. So you have to be very mindful of your history, because your understanding of your history determines how you're going to be able to interpret those records, particularly in earlier periods where they're more scattered. Here's me. I do a bunch of different research. I don't do just Swedish. I also do US, British Isles, some Danish. I also do DNA as well. I hope that perhaps we might be able to work together. If you have a project you want to have worked on, or even if you know somebody that say, hey, I think it'd be great if you worked with this individual. I know that they might have needs, or that person can contact me and we can have a conversation and talk about getting them started. So I invite you to contact me through my website. I do have this number, but it'd be nice if you texted it first, because I'm not always able to pick up the phone. But I'll try to pick up the phone if I'm available. Thank you, and bye-bye.